Thank you again for the invitation to be here. And so, Konstantina, I can't believe that you're both moderating and organizing. This is like a bit crazy, but very well respected. So thank you. Federica, thank you so much for this presentation. It was great, and I'm very much looking forward also to Yvonne's presentation next, who I wish could be here today, but unfortunately is not able to in person. So I'm from an organization called Mnemonic. We founded a project called Syrian Archive in 2014. I'll get into this in a moment. Sure, is that better? Perfect. Perfect. So before I get into the meat of the talk itself, which is talking about 40 years of footage in Syria Alone, and I'll get into what that means in a little bit. This is preliminary results from a paper that I'm co-writing with one of my colleagues, Libby McAvoy, so a lawyer who's working with our organization. And I just want to give a bit of information about who we are as an organization first. So we work globally, but specifically in the MENA region, so Middle East, North Africa, to help human rights defenders effectively use digital documentation of human rights violations and international crimes for advocacy, justice, and accountability. And largely when I'm talking about digital documentation, I'm talking about open source information. To give a super quick history, in 2014, we started a project called Syrian Archive as a rapid response project. So our founder, Hadi Al-Khatib, Syrian national, working with lawyers, human rights defenders, activists, doing trainings on the massive amounts of content that's being published, in the context of Syria, largely published to social media channels, how to verify it, how to archive it, how to make the best use of it, right? And we were seeing that already then, 2012, 2013, a lot of this content was being removed. So we built kind of like a grassroots emergency preservation project, right, to kind of just get this off of some of these platforms Federica was just talking about. But then we also expanded. So we used some of the tools and the methods that we had for Syria also to apply in other contexts, which are highly documented, like Yemen or Sudan. We're an interdisciplinary team, so lawyers, technologists, journalists, I'm a sociologist myself, so many people from many different backgrounds. And importantly, most of the people who are working on the projects are from these conflict areas themselves. What this looks like in practice is that we do three things in regards to archiving, and there's some other stuff, but I'll focus on these three now. The first, looking at preservation, so taking this content that's online, making sure it's on different secure technical infrastructures, and we're trying to meet certain kinds of international standards of preservation, which I can also get into in a bit. Two is verifying this content, so getting it, on secure infrastructure, but also trying to make use of it to contextualize it. And the third is identifying and using different data tags to try to make sense of it, right? To make it searchable, things like this. And in practice, this looks like things like taking this open source documentation and working to try to file, for example, criminal complaints. We've done 3 in the last 18 months, relating specifically to chemical weapons attacks in Syria, 1 in Germany, 1 in France, and 1 in Sweden, regarding 2 specific cases, which I'm happy to go into in a bit. So open source information, I know this was covered a bit before, so I'm not going to go into too much, but we're talking about content that's publicly available, right? Like news articles, maps, satellite imagery, and largely social media content, right? So in our context, we're talking largely about Facebook content, Twitter content, and YouTube content. And in case of Syria, we have about 3.5 million records, right, that we have in our system, about half of which are coming from YouTube. Open source in general has risen very much in previous years, as you know, both in the media scene. So here, like, New York Times Visual Investigations team, Amnesty International through their Digital Verification Corps, who we partner with sometimes, Human Rights Watch, who we also partner with on this investigation into chlorine attacks in the siege of Aleppo. And as was alluded to in the previous presentation, I'm sure will also be by Yvonne, in legal environments, although this is new, right? So we do have the Upper Fali arrest warrants based largely on Facebook content, right? In this particular case, sure. in this particular case, they were able to authenticate the Facebook information by talking specifically with the platforms, right? This is something that we are not able to do as a civil society group, but something that many of you are in a position to be able to do. But there's a number of problems with using open source materials in general. And I'm not going to go into detail about the first three, but I can during the discussion afterwards. The first, as was just alluded to, the fact that a lot of this content is at risk of being removed, both before upload, but also afterwards. The second, dealing with verification, and we can talk about how that happens. The third, in terms of the content itself, even if you've observed it and you have it verified, like being able to search through it to find relevant materials. But specifically within legal context, we're talking about the fact that this is largely untested, right? With a few notable exceptions, as has been discussed during this conference. So my co-author and I have an observation related to this, as was discussed yesterday in a presentation from Stephanie. Participation legitimizes certain kinds of legal processes, right? So what we're seeing right now in terms of the open source community, right, the people who are working on doing these kinds of investigations, is that there isn't a large amount of participation in terms of the preservation and processing, but also in terms of the investigations that are being done themselves. We're also seeing that since, despite mountains of evidence that's being produced, the open source community isn't adequately addressing the issues of scalability, right? And so we're seeing something like this, right? We're seeing on the left-hand side, the open source community having this massive content that tends to be narrowed down into one-off investigations. And as you do so, you have a inherently less participation, right? You're excluding certain content, certain sources, certain file types, right? But and certain material because it might not be relevant, right? And within a legal context, we see a similar pattern, right? So there's a lot of potential cases, and then these are all narrowed down into individual cases, right? Maybe potentially, like in the case of universal jurisdiction. There's certain reasons this has to happen, right? But maybe we don't have to have this mirroring of the open source investigative community that's trying to emulate, let's say, some of the models proposed by ICL. And so we have a question, starting with the statement: the scale of violations in their documentations in these settings issues a challenge and a demand to people seeking to contribute to this justice work. The question is, how can the open source fields, especially given that it feeds into justice processes, be as participatory as the documentation of violations that it relies upon? And our proposal is that by taking somewhat of a more database-wide approach, right, we have the possibility of doing three things, which I'm going to focus on in this presentation. Assessing this content for its usability, its usefulness, and its significance in context. And this, we would argue, increases the potential for different types or increased participation within the civil society and justice spaces. So we're really talking about issues of scale and participation here. And when we're talking about scale, as I mentioned, the title of this talk is 40 years of footage from Syria Alone. And we recently did a data audit of the number of files, as well as the length of each file, right? So by calculating, multiplying one against the other, we can find how much footage we have. And we've realized that we have over 40 years of footage in 10 years of conflict, right? So there's more hours of footage about the conflict than hours in the conflict itself. This presents huge issues of scale. And if we press play, Libby and I write, we would be watching the entire archive, nonstop until 2061. This is way too much for any one organization, or individual, right? And there needs to be ways of addressing some of these issues. There's a couple of characteristics that we're seeing in terms of the content that we have. One, you could argue that because a lot of this is coming from social media, it might be seen as more participatory than other forms of evidence or documentation, although this is up for debate. Two, this is largely visual content, so about half of the content that we have is visual, which connects a lot to, from a legal perspective, this idea of witnessing or testimony in a non-legal space or an advocacy space, ideas of emotive advocacy, right? So if we can see somebody talking, we can understand the situation more. And the third, it has the potential for evidentiary use, um, uh, although that's not certain, right? So there's a number of different outputs, outcomes, and impacts that we've identified. And here we're talking about, with scaled up open source projects, increased variety and diversity of potential uses, including but also not limited to ICL. We're talking about increased volume and variety of data types, right? And increased volumes of potential cases. And I can talk about what this looks like in a second. But here we're talking about, I mean, this is mostly volume, variety, velocity. These are the 3 V's of big data. And there's so much data being produced, we need to be applying a big data approach towards the documentation itself. Of course, there's many more, right? To go into usability, right? As you know, many of you are lawyers. You know that, you know, for content to be considered evidence, it needs to be both usable and useful, right? As was talked about in the last presentation from Federica, we have things like confidence scores, right, which we assign for each piece of content, an observation or a record, right, like an individual video or a post. You know, ranging from 0, right? It's maybe worth archiving, but maybe doesn't have anything that's potentially relevant, right? Or could be proved wrong. To 3, which is, you know, very likely to have occurred or very reliable. And so we would argue, you know, that if properly verifiable, some of these records might have use as digital evidence. But because we assign a different score to these objects, we could potentially think of having use of these objects beyond just ICL, right? And potentially in different spaces. And that goes into the idea of usefulness, right? So usefulness being, what can we observe within a particular object itself and isn't relevant, right? By starting our process of data collection, looking at designing a metadata schema or an ontology, you know, we define, for example, the certain kinds of tags that we're going to be using on an incident or on an observation-based level. Once these are identified in the verification process, they might at scale be able to be used potentially in order to look at documentation of violence or base crimes, but also potentially for more complex things like linkage evidence, right? But the third component is that we need to think about significance and context. And so while we have an incident or an observation-based database, right, let's say 2,000 videos, right, we need to contextualize these. And so we need to build another database on top of this. I know this is a lot of database talk, but basically it's organizing data into a relational database where we say these 10 videos belong to the same incident, right? And by describing this at an incident level, we can have descriptions of particular incidents that could feed into more contextual information. This allows us to potentially look at pattern evidence, for example, looking at patterns in crimes, patterns in intent, patterns in proportionality, and so on and so forth, right? And so what we're seeing, if we go back to this original, you know, visualization, is rather than trying to focus on a one-off investigation, maybe we can scale this out a bit and think about a more scaled up open source environment. And within a legal setting, right, although we still start with a number of cases, right, and of course we're still going to have to be restricting these some, potentially we can be thinking of things outside of just the universal jurisdiction model, as was alluded to yesterday in the keynote address, and include other forms of more transitional justice approaches, as was talked about as well today. So we, in our work, have a data and operational model, which I'm not sure you can see in detail here, but I'm happy to go into later. It's following roughly the electronic discovery reference model put out by Duke University School of Law and used by many people. So this has the collection phases, preservation phases, processing, verification, and identification or investigation. And I'm happy to talk about this more in a bit. To talk about a concrete example of what this looks like in terms of our work, we earlier this year put out a database with Syrian Archive looking at attacks on hospitals and medical facilities, finding documentation of 410 incidents, right? And by using a certain types of contextual indicators, right? we were able to identify in 374 incidents potential indicators of intentionality. Now, of course, this isn't certain, right? But this might be useful for example, legal groups as a case building tool. And this looks at things like whether or not there was a repeated attack on a hospital. Some of them have been attacked many times. Clustered attacks. So for example, whether there was a chemical attack at a site and then very shortly after also an attack on the hospital that was nearby treating patients. Whether or not there were characteristics of targeting, and I can go into those. Known to parties, things like whether it was established prior to the conflict, right? And so its existence should have been known, or whether its coordinates were reported as part of the deconfliction mechanism. This might be some indicator that it should have been known, right? And so while many of these on their own might not be an indicator, right? When put together, you can see things like, so here's a direct hit on a remote location, for example. This is a hospital that's in a remote area far from the front line. And there was an airstrike that led directly to it, right? And so on and so forth. Repeated attacks, as I've mentioned. So I know that I'm somewhat short on time, but I want to mention that we're doing this in terms of not only Syria work, but also in terms of the work in Yemen and also in terms of Sudan, looking not only at indicators at an observation level, but also at a more contextual level to try to understand not only within an ICL framework, but also potential other uses in terms of case selection. So I'm happy to go into this in more detail later, but I'll conclude with just a couple of thoughts that we have. The first, as was mentioned yesterday also, participation is used to measure this feeling of legitimacy of justice processes and their outcomes. But knowing this, there is, we would argue, a crisis of scale and participation within the open source for accountability work. Recognizing this, such open source investigative projects in the accountability sense, as well as their outcomes in terms of a one-off individual investigation model, tend not to be very participatory. And as such, we would argue that they don't or cannot adequately feel legitimate or support some kind of legitimization of justice processes. We would argue that a scaled up open source investigative approach has the potential to increase these participation processes, but we would fifth end by saying that a scaled up approach on its own is not going to do so without the need to explicitly include participation at different stages, whether this be the methods, the sources, the verification processes, the publication processes, and so on. We are still figuring this out. And again, we are a civil society group. We have some lawyers and we work with lawyers, but I'm not a lawyer myself. We are looking to increase participation in different processes that we have. If you have suggestions on how to do so, or if you have suggestions on how you can use the data, please let me know. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you so much.